Imagine being told that some of the most famous stories ever created were not really stories at all. Imagine that thousands of years ago, ancient Greeks told tales of powerful gods, mysterious monsters, lost cities, terrifying disasters, and heroic warriors. And then, centuries later, archaeologists began uncovering evidence that made people stop and ask one uncomfortable question: what if some of these myths were based on real events? For generations, Greek mythology was treated as nothing more than imagination. Zeus throwing lightning bolts from the heavens, Poseidon controlling the seas, heroes fighting monsters, warriors destroying great cities. These were stories told around fires, in temples, and in ancient poems. But the deeper we dig into the ancient world, the stranger the story becomes. Because beneath the gods and monsters, beneath the magic and supernatural events, there are places, people, wars, disasters, and traditions that appear to have had real historical roots. And tonight, we're going on a journey through some of the greatest Greek myths that turned out to be far more complicated than anyone expected. But before we begin, there's something important to understand. When we say a Greek myth turned out to be true, we don't mean that Zeus was literally sitting on Mount Olympus throwing lightning bolts at humans. We mean that behind a legendary story, archaeologists and historians sometimes discovered a real place, a real civilization, a real war, or a real natural event that may have inspired the myth. And one of those discoveries changed the way people looked at Greek mythology forever. It began with a city that many people believed had never existed, Troy. For thousands of years, the story of Troy was known primarily through the poems associated with Homer, especially the Iliad. According to the legend, Troy was a magnificent and powerful city ruled by King Priam. And then came the most famous conflict in Greek mythology, the Trojan War. The story begins with a prince named Paris, who became involved in a divine competition between three goddesses. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all wanted to be declared the most beautiful. Paris was chosen to make the decision. Each goddess offered him something in return: power, wisdom, and the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite, and the woman she promised him was Helen. There was only one problem. Helen was already married. Her husband was Menelaus, king of Sparta. Paris took Helen to Troy, and Menelaus was furious. Greek kings gathered their armies, ships crossed the Aegean Sea, and an enormous war began. For 10 years, Greeks and Trojans fought. Heroes such as Achilles, Hector, Ajax, and Odysseus became legendary, and eventually came the famous Trojan horse. The Greeks appeared to abandon the war and leave behind a gigantic wooden horse. The Trojans brought the horse inside their city, but Greek soldiers were hiding inside. During the night, they emerged, opened the city gates, and allowed the Greek army to enter. Troy fell. For centuries, people assumed the entire story was simply a legend. Then, in the 19th century, a wealthy German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann became obsessed with finding Troy. Many scholars thought he was chasing a fantasy, but Schliemann believed Homer had described a real location. He began excavations in modern-day Turkey, and then he found something. The ruins of an ancient settlement existed at the site traditionally associated with Troy. Not a perfect confirmation of every detail in Homer's story. Not proof that Achilles actually existed. Not proof that a wooden horse filled with Greek soldiers really entered the city. But there was something remarkable beneath the legend. There really was an ancient city at Troy. And even more fascinating, archaeologists discovered evidence that the site had been violently destroyed multiple times. This didn't prove the Trojan War exactly as Homer described it. But suddenly, the story didn't look completely imaginary anymore. It became possible that ancient poets had preserved memories of real conflicts that happened more than 3,000 years ago. And that raises a fascinating possibility. Maybe myths weren't created from nothing. Maybe they were distorted memories of real events. Events that became larger and more dramatic every time the story was retold. And if Troy was real, what else could be hiding beneath Greek mythology? Let's travel deeper into the ancient world, because the next mystery takes us to one of the most famous civilizations of the Bronze Age, the Minoans. Long before classical Greece became the civilization we usually imagine, a sophisticated culture flourished on the island of Crete. They built enormous palaces. They created beautiful artwork. They developed complex systems of administration. And at the center of their world was a massive palace complex at Knossos. When archaeologists uncovered Knossos, they found something that sounded strangely familiar. A huge, complicated structure filled with rooms, corridors, stairways, storage areas, and interconnected spaces. It was easy to imagine becoming completely lost inside it. And suddenly, people remembered another Greek story, the story of the Minotaur. According to the myth, King Minos of Crete possessed a terrifying creature, half man, half bull. The Minotaur lived inside a gigantic maze called the Labyrinth. Young Athenians were sent to Crete as sacrifices. Then came the hero Theseus. Theseus entered the labyrinth, fought the Minotaur, and killed the monster. He escaped by following a thread given to him by Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos. Now, did archaeologists discover a literal maze containing a half-human, half-bull creature? No. But the discovery of Knossos created a fascinating connection. The palace was enormous and complicated enough that ancient people could easily have associated it with a labyrinth. And bulls were extremely important in Minoan culture. Archaeologists discovered countless bull images, bull sculptures, and artwork showing people performing dangerous rituals involving bulls. One famous Minoan activity appears to have involved people leaping over bulls. So when later generations told stories about a mysterious Cretan king, a labyrinth, and a terrifying bull-like creature, they may have been transforming real cultural traditions into mythology. The Minotaur may never have existed, but the world that inspired the Minotaur, that world was real. And perhaps the most interesting part is this: the word labyrinth itself may be connected to the mysterious symbol or term associated with the Great Palace at Knossos. So perhaps the legend of the labyrinth wasn't simply invented by someone sitting around trying to create a scary story. Perhaps it was born from the memory of a real place, a gigantic palace, a powerful civilization, and rituals involving bulls that ancient people could barely forget. But Greek mythology doesn't stop there. Another famous story tells us about one of the greatest disasters imaginable. A civilization destroyed by the sea, a legendary island, a powerful kingdom, and a catastrophe so enormous that the story survived for thousands of years. Atlantis. You've probably heard the story. Plato described Atlantis as a powerful island civilization that existed far beyond the known world. Its people were wealthy, its cities were magnificent, its society was powerful, but according to Plato, the Atlanteans eventually became morally corrupt, and then disaster came. The island was destroyed and disappeared beneath the sea. For centuries, people have searched for Atlantis. Some have placed it in the Atlantic Ocean. Others have suggested the Mediterranean. Some have connected it to Santorini. And this is where history becomes incredibly interesting. Around the 2nd millennium BC, the island of Thera, known today as Santorini, experienced one of the most enormous volcanic eruptions in human history. The eruption was catastrophic. Ash and volcanic material were thrown high into the atmosphere. The surrounding region was devastated. Huge amounts of volcanic debris covered parts of the island, and the eruption may have generated massive waves across the Aegean. A nearby civilization, the Minoans, was affected by the disaster. Did Plato's Atlantis definitely refer to Santorini? No, there is no definitive proof, and Plato himself presented Atlantis within a philosophical story. But the similarities are fascinating. A powerful Aegean civilization, a catastrophic natural disaster, cities destroyed, the sea becoming an instrument of destruction, and memories of ancient disasters surviving long after the people who witnessed them were gone. Imagine being a person living thousands of years ago and watching the sky turn dark. Imagine hearing the earth shake beneath your feet. Imagine seeing a massive volcanic eruption and realizing that your entire world was changing. You wouldn't need modern science to understand that something supernatural had happened. You would tell your children, they would tell theirs. And eventually, a real natural disaster could become a legend about gods punishing humans. This may explain something important about mythology. Ancient people didn't have satellites. They didn't have seismographs. They didn't have volcanology. They didn't know about tectonic plates. So when nature behaved in ways they couldn't explain, they turned those events into stories. And those stories survive. Now let's move to another legendary figure, one of the greatest heroes in all of Greek mythology. Heracles, or as the Romans later called him, Hercules. His strength was legendary. He fought the Nemean lion. He battled the Hydra. He captured the Erymanthian boar. He stole the golden apples. He descended into the underworld. And he completed 12 impossible labors. At first glance, Heracles seems completely fictional, a superhuman warrior fighting monsters. But there is another possibility. Maybe heroes like Heracles were inspired by real warriors whose stories became exaggerated over time. Think about how legends are created even today. A successful athlete becomes a hero. A brave soldier becomes a legend. A famous leader becomes larger than life. Now imagine what happens when the story is told for hundreds of years before anyone writes it down. A strong warrior becomes the strongest man alive. A dangerous animal becomes a monster. A difficult journey becomes a supernatural quest. A successful battle becomes a fight against a creature nobody else could defeat. The original person disappears. The legend remains. And there may have been many real heroes behind the stories of Greek mythology, because archaeology has shown us that the Bronze Age Aegean world was not peaceful. These societies possessed weapons, they built fortifications, they fought wars, and they produced warriors whose lives may have inspired later generations. But perhaps the most surprising Greek myth connected to real history is not about a hero, it's about an entire civilization, the Mycenaeans. If you've ever imagined the warriors of the Trojan War, you're probably imagining something like the Mycenaean world. These people lived in Greece during the Bronze Age. They built massive fortified centers. They controlled trade routes. They created impressive palaces. And their civilization eventually collapsed. This is important because Homer describes a world of powerful kings, warrior elites, ships, alliances, rival kingdoms, and enormous conflicts. For a long time, scholars wondered how much of that world reflected reality. Then archaeology began revealing something extraordinary. The Mycenaean civilization was real, and some of the places mentioned in later Greek traditions appear to have connections to actual Bronze Age centers. Mycenae itself was real. Pylos was real. Thebes was real. and the world of powerful palace kingdoms was real. Even more fascinating, archaeologists discovered linear B tablets. These were ancient administrative records written in an early form of Greek. They recorded things like goods, workers, livestock, and religious offerings. Suddenly, the Bronze Age Greeks were no longer just characters from mythology. They had left behind their own written records. We could see pieces of their actual lives. And this creates a fascinating question. If the world described in Greek heroic poetry contains real places and reflects a real warrior culture, how much of the legendary past might have survived in distorted form? Maybe Homer wasn't inventing an entirely imaginary world. Maybe he was preserving fragments of a much older memory, a memory that had been passed from generation to generation. And then there is another myth that sounds almost too strange to have any connection to reality, the story of the Amazons. According to Greek mythology, the Amazons were fierce warrior women who lived beyond the familiar Greek world. Greek heroes fought them. Achilles fought the Amazon queen Penthesilea. Heracles was said to have confronted the Amazon queen Hippolyta. For a long time, many people assumed the Amazons were purely fictional, but archaeology has revealed something extremely interesting. Across parts of the Eurasian steppe, archaeologists have discovered ancient graves of women buried with weapons. Some of these women were buried with bows, arrows, swords, and other objects associated with warfare. Some skeletons also showed injuries consistent with combat. These discoveries don't prove that every story about the Amazons was true, but they show that warrior women were not simply an impossible fantasy. There were societies where women could participate in warfare, and ancient Greeks may have encountered or heard stories about these warrior women. Over time, those memories could have transformed into the legendary Amazons. So once again, the myth may contain a historical echo, not literal truth, but a memory of something real. And that may be the most fascinating thing about mythology. It doesn't always have to be completely true to contain truth. Sometimes the truth is hiding underneath the exaggeration. A real city becomes a legendary kingdom. A real warrior becomes a demigod. A natural disaster becomes divine punishment. A powerful civilization becomes the home of monsters. And a dangerous enemy becomes an army of mythical creatures. But there is one final story that brings all of these ideas together. The story of the Greek gods themselves: Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite. To modern people, these gods can seem like pure fantasy. But ancient Greek religion was absolutely real. People worshipped these gods. They built temples for them. They offered sacrifices. They created statues. They traveled long distances to visit sacred sites. And they believed that the gods could influence their lives. One of the most famous religious centers was Delphi. People traveled there to consult the oracle. According to tradition, the priestess known as the Pythia would enter a trance, like state, and deliver mysterious prophecies associated with Apollo. Kings consulted the oracle before wars. Individuals asked about marriages, journeys, politics, and the future. For centuries, the oracle at Delphi was one of the most important religious institutions in the Greek world. And here's the fascinating part. Modern researchers have investigated the geological environment beneath Delphi. The sanctuary sits in an area with geological faults. Some researchers have proposed that natural gases rising through cracks in the ground may have contributed to unusual experiences at the site. There is still debate over exactly what happened, but the location itself is geologically unusual. And that reminds us again that ancient religious experiences may sometimes have had physical explanations that people at the time couldn't understand. To them, the voice of Apollo might have been completely real. To modern science, some of the experiences may have natural causes, but the cultural impact was enormous. And perhaps that is the real secret behind Greek mythology. The myths survived because they were not just stories. They were connected to places, to wars, to disasters, to religious traditions, to kings, to heroes, to human fears, and to questions that humans have been asking for thousands of years. Why do disasters happen? Why do people fight? Why do heroes rise? Why do civilizations collapse? What happens after death? Can humans challenge the gods? Can pride destroy a kingdom? Can courage defeat impossible odds? These questions are still with us, and maybe that's why Greek mythology has never truly disappeared. We still tell stories about heroes. We still fear monsters. We still search for lost civilizations. We still wonder whether legends contain fragments of forgotten history. And we still look at ancient ruins and ask, what really happened here? Perhaps somewhere beneath the ruins of Troy, someone really did remember an ancient war. Perhaps the labyrinth began with the enormous palace at Knossos. Perhaps the story of Atlantis preserved distant memories of one of the greatest disasters of the Bronze Age. Perhaps the Amazons were inspired by real warrior women. Perhaps the legendary heroes were based on real people whose achievements became exaggerated through generations of storytelling. And perhaps the ancient Greeks were doing something humans have always done. They were trying to make sense of a world they couldn't fully explain. But there is one lesson we should never forget. A myth doesn't have to be literally true to preserve a piece of history. Sometimes history survives as a broken fragment, a poem, a ruined city, a strange tradition, a burial site, a symbol carved into stone, or a story passed from parent to child for thousands of years. And sometimes, when archaeologists uncover the right piece of the puzzle, the old story suddenly looks different, not completely true, not completely false, but something in between, a memory wrapped in imagination, a historical event transformed into legend, a real place turned into a mythical kingdom, a disaster transformed into a story about angry gods. And that may be why Greek mythology continues to fascinate us. Because somewhere between the monsters and the gods, between the heroes and the miracles, there may be pieces of a world that really existed, a world lost beneath the soil, a world swallowed by the sea, a world destroyed by war, a world whose people disappeared, but whose stories survived. So the next time you hear the story of Troy, think about the ruins beneath the earth. When you hear about the Minotaur, remember the enormous palace at Knossos. When you hear about Atlantis, remember that the ancient Aegean world really did experience catastrophes powerful enough to reshape civilizations. When you hear about the Amazons, remember the warrior women whose graves have been discovered thousands of miles from Greece. And when you hear the ancient stories of heroes and gods, remember that mythology is rarely as simple as true or false. Sometimes legends are shadows cast by real events. And sometimes those shadows are all that remain. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious side of Greek mythology, don't just leave this video here. Share it with someone who loves ancient history, mythology, archaeology, or unexplained mysteries. And if you want more stories where ancient legends collide with real history, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because there are still thousands of ancient mysteries waiting beneath the ruins, and some of them may be much closer to the truth than we ever imagined. Until the next journey, keep questioning the legends, because sometimes the oldest stories in the world are hiding the newest discoveries.